really technically we define international student athletes as any student athlete who's a non-resident alien of the US. So that's how we qualify them, even those that potentially had done a year or two of high school in the US, but still aren't permanent residents or citizens. So non-resident aliens who are competing in college athletics. Currently, that number is about 20,000 ISAs that are participating in NCAA athletics across all of the divisions. And in sports like tennis, potentially upwards of 50%, and in tennis, more than 50% of the student athletes participating in that sport collegiately are international, which is what makes this such a crucial issue for coaches and administrators to be aware of. One of the greatest challenges that ISAs face when they decide to pursue participation in college athletics is just understanding what the collegiate experience is like in the US. More than 95% of ISAs never step foot on campus throughout their entire recruiting process. So that means that their first year, when they show up in the summer, for that first training camp or for, move-in week, that's the first time that they've ever been on that campus. And many students and research have noted that because the most popularized versions and kind of pop culture and what's exported to the world of the US is of some of the US largest cities like New York and LA in particular, that they're kind of a little bit shocked when they decide to come in the US and they're in small college towns. Right. So that's a lot different than what they might have been expecting or what they've experienced, or vice versa. If you have someone that comes from a more rural area to, a huge college campus or to a city campus, that can be a shock as well. An additional challenge in deciding to come to the US and compete in college sport are some of these recruiting companies who charge into the thousands of dollars to international student athletes or hopeful international student athletes, promising to promote them as an athlete to coaches in the US and earn them athletic scholarships. Unfortunately, these companies can be predatory sometimes. They'll sign any student that's willing to pay, regardless of their actual chances of obtaining a spot on a team or funding in the US. So that's something to look out for as well. To start off, not necessarily related to inclusivity directly, but I think it's incredibly important for college coaches to be upfront and honest with student athletes about their expectations and what campus is like. We know that every single campus is completely different. US universities are diverse in terms of size, their location, their particular culture, depending on what part of the US they're in. So setting realistic expectations during recruitment is definitely going to result in a more successful athlete up front. Statistics tell us that ISAs are transferring universities at the highest rate of any other student athlete group. And that's important, right? Because we're making this investment into a student athlete, potentially giving scholarship money there. And so if they're dissatisfied with their school selection because they haven't visited and they feel like they didn't get the right impression during the recruitment process, that's a year of funding and training that is then gone, not just for that student athlete, but also for the coaching staff and for the team as a whole. So setting that expectation and recruiting student athletes who want to be on the type of campus that you have to offer is crucial, because there are student athletes that indicate they want to be at bigger schools, at smaller schools, in more rural areas and in more urban areas. And so I think it's not your type of institution isn't going to necessarily drive away every single student athlete. So that's really important as well. And just listening, having a team culture that's really open to listening to one another, understanding one another, and that you have that culture built in, that you're accepting of a lot of different cultures, that you're going to come together for one team culture and one unified team. But that doesn't mean that one single person is having to assimilate or change their entire being to be a part of that team, I think is really critical. There are a whole host of challenges that we've seen come up with international student athletes. From the beginning, support through the TOEFL and visa processes is critical. Having support staff to assist ISAs through this process from the get-go is really going to show them that the school team and coaching staff are all really invested in them and value them as part of the team. Frequently checking in, helping them through that process of getting paperwork done, of pointing them to the right person who will help them with all of their visa questions, and also supporting them through that TOEFL process, because the same way that we look at struggles of domestic student athletes in getting SAT scores because they're not good test takers, we're asking them to not only take an SAT, ACT, but also to take the TOEFL, all in potentially not their first language. So it's really critical to kind of work with them and help them understand, and not let them get discouraged if they don't necessarily score where they want to at the beginning, because it is something that can be difficult just depending on people's test taking abilities and not necessarily their actual academic abilities. Once they're on campus, navigating life in the US obviously is difficult and can be different depending on what specific country or region of the world the student athlete is from. You have some who have closer proximity, both culturally and language-wise, like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. But then you have some that have completely different languages, who have different cultures and different ways of life. So that's really important. Some of those issues that we might not even think about, but have come up in previous research that we've done include things like not being adjusted to training in the type of climate that your university is in. Is it hotter? Is it colder? Is the elevation different? That's a huge thing for someone that's competing at an elite level, to be training in a completely different environment, as well as not being able to find the foods that are a part of their normal day-to-day nutrition where they're taking care of their body. So if they don't know or don't have access to a grocery store that sells things they're used to, or able to find on campus those items, helping them either be able to find those items somewhere in the community so they can continue to have some of the food from home that they've been using while training, but also working with nutritionists or other people on campus to find food and make healthy options. Also ensuring, besides just the nutrition and classroom stuff, medical support is key, and academic support as well. It's just really important. Obviously, those are going to be the same thing that you see with some of the domestic student athletes, but domestic student athletes are a little bit more used to the way that healthcare works in the US, as well as kind of classroom expectations. It'll be a little different high school to college, but not that same drastic shift that we might see other places, just because college in the US tends to be a lot more group oriented and speaking out and presentation focused than student athletes have indicated it is other places in the world. And then again, although the sport is played exactly the same as their domestic counterparts, they're still playing tennis. International tennis recruits are just not as likely to have been training in the type of team setting that college tennis is, where someone who's playing college tennis as a domestic student athlete might have played in high school where it's team tennis. They might not have that same experience. And it is different competing for a team versus only focusing on being that individual. They might have experience previously with physios, which is going to be the closest equivalent to an athletic trainer, but not that specific role, and also not the specific type of medical care. There are different cultures and countries that use medicine differently and different types of therapies differently. So helping them understand that the AT is truly there for their well-being and having, their best interest in mind. It can be tough, like anyone going to a new doctor, you have to build that trust. And an athletic trainer is essentially one of the few physician type people that someone is going to see throughout their athletic career. And so it's important for them to understand that role as well. And then rewriting a lot of potentially what their training regimen looks like. We see some student athletes who feel like it's just the norm when they come to campus in terms of the expectations, and others who indicate that it's a lot more intense in terms of the hours dedicated to practice and training along with school. Some international student athletes may not have been training and in school at the same time. They may have taken a little bit of time off in between and only been focusing on sport. And so to dedicate a significant chunk of time to both sport and school is a big adjustment as well. The best advice that I can give to work collectively as a team, have a plan with your student athlete support office, see what resources that they have to offer. Sometimes it's just going to be one contact person, but that person is generally really well connected throughout campus to get student athlete support from different areas. Many larger offices have already put together specialized support groups and mentoring programs for new ISAs, and then know what campus resources exist and provide. Many campuses have a good number of international students who aren't athletes, and they have resources available to assist those students through different processes, adjustments, visa issues, etc. And so not just staying within that athletic bubble will greatly help you in being able to provide resources to your international recruits. Some of the research that I've done shows that the resources that student athletes are indicating they would like to have access to already exist across campus. They're just unaware of how to access those resources. So that's really key when we're talking about bringing international student athletes to campus and making them feel welcome and making them feel supported. It doesn't always mean reinventing the wheel. As intercollegiate athletics professionals, we tend to get so wrapped up in our own world of athletics and existing within that. I know I did when I worked in an athletic department. We have separate support staffs, academic services, all those different things. But campuses themselves are prepared to welcome international students and international student athletes to campus. They host events. They take international student athletes shopping at ethnic markets to find food that they're used to. There are clubs for certain languages and countries and cultures where ISAs can meet other students who might have similar shared life experiences. Within athletics, there's a wealth of resources that we can direct ISAs to as well. It's just knowing where to go with the question is the best practice. So as coaches, don't feel like you need to take on everything yourself, but know that educating yourself first, at minimum, where to search for some of these answers and who to ask for specific questions is going to be key. So get to know your campus in the same way that maybe a new student would, and learn the resources, the offices, make connections with people there, so you know what phone to pick up when you have a certain issue that arises with a student athlete. Supporting international college coaches is going to be really similar to the way that we help international student athletes adjust. I know that I've worked with campuses where the international office can be, just as helpful, not just for the students when they're arriving on campus, when they stay as well, might be pursuing work visas. So they're going to have expertise, not just in the student visa area potentially, and that can be helpful for international coaches. Additionally, coaches are going through the same kind of cultural adjustment that international student athletes are. They're just not having that classroom adjustment, especially if this is the first time that they're coaching in the US. So understanding that, giving them time off where needed, understanding what their traditions are, right? Do they have holidays that are deeply important to their home culture? And if that means, like I mentioned, the time off, or finding a way for the team to kind of learn about what those traditions are and have them kind of help celebrate and really show that everyone is supportive. This goes for your international student athletes as well as the coaches. So everyone's going to have, part of that cultural adjustment is not being used to what the holidays are. So learning from one another and that openness to learn and kind of celebrate with one another can really help with that team culture and bringing people together and having that sense of belonging. That's really key, not just for the international student athletes, but the coaches as well. That's really important, I think, and work to meet in the middle on some things and don't focus on making that person assimilate fully to just because that's the way that things work. I think, again, that can be brought in with international student athletes as well, and not just the coaches, but just like we'd hope to learn new things or gain perspective or implement new ways of training from a domestic coach, do the same for the international coach. Don't just dismiss their ideas or assume that they're just going to have to learn how to be what you think a college coach looks like in the US, because they could bring something really valuable to your team. ISAs, like all student athletes, aren't always focused years ahead. They're really kind of in that moment, competing, going to class, getting that day-to-day routine down. And then before we know it, they've gone through 4 or 5 years of competition. But we're a domestic student athlete can afford the luxury of graduating and kind of being unsure of what they're going to do next once they exit. International student athletes do not. Their student visas are going to expire. So even if they opt for the OPT option, which allows ISAs to remain in the US for up to 1 year after graduation, as they search for employment, those visa extensions still have to be applied for in advance. It's not something that automatically kicks in. And then depending on what type of visa the student athlete is pursuing, so you might have someone who's pursuing to stay here and compete still. You might have someone who is looking for a job, who's going to graduate school where they need a student visa extension if they get accepted. It's going to be different. And some of those visa processes are going to take upwards of a year, especially now. Processes have slowed a lot in the area of getting visas and green cards processed due to COVID-19. So start talking to ISAs early about their post-college plans so that you can help point them in the right direction and get them the right resources. Even if they say, they think they want to go home or they're not 100% sure yet what they want to do, putting on the radar that that student athlete is going to have some sort of plan the second that graduation comes, that they have to start working, that full year ahead of their senior year, that they might need to take some time and be more flexible with practice times to get an internship, to get their foot in the door so that they can find a company that's really willing to sponsor their visa is going to be key, because it's really, really difficult. It's not simply a process of finding a job and someone hires you. The visa process means they have to find a job that's in their field of study. It means they have to make an argument for why they're a better candidate than someone from the US. And it can be a lengthy and really kind of mentally exhausting process. So really making sure that they're supported and that you're talking about this on the front end so they don't feel surprised when you get to senior year, middle of senior year, towards the end of senior year, and scrambling to try and get things done to make sure that student can stay. I don't know if I have one specific resource that can be helpful that is really ISA specific for anything. Um, and that's partly because it's just an understudied area, unfortunately, and there's not a lot of resources out there, despite this being one of the fastest growing groups of student athletes represented within the NCAA. It's little studied and little covered, which could be really frustrating. I know that telling my students in the classroom to go read journal articles is difficult as well, but there are some really good baseline studies out there. Even if you just go and look at what the results are, you can see how different student athletes at different NCAA levels or in different types of universities have responded and indicated what some of their struggles have been in their transition to college and their experience playing college athletics. And then honestly, the NCAA has a really comprehensive page on their website as well that includes a lot of data and resources regarding recruiting and rules. It breaks things down by specific countries, divisions. It has a lot of helpful answers there if you're really just someone who is getting into starting to recruit internationally, or you're going into a country where you haven't before and need kind of some information there on what to do and what to look for. Asking this question makes me feel like maybe that I should write something, or that we should get some people together to write something, because it is just something that doesn't exist in that like wonderful, International Student Athletes for Dummies book that we could just pull off the shelf. But in all honesty, I'll just go back to forming a really good relationship with your student athlete support office and point person, as well as the International Student Athlete Office, and learning from them is going to be the most helpful. Those people are experts in how everything works on your campus, the recruitment process, the admissions process, the visa process, and they've seen these students, unless this is the absolute first international student athlete that you're bringing to campus, they've seen a lot of students in different sports from different parts of the world and how they've adjusted and how they've struggled on campus. So there are so many existing resources that I think a lot of time coaches aren't even necessarily aware of that are there and exist to help students go through this process and not feel alone.